All right, so our last class on the Dormant Commerce Clause, we look at one example of a discriminatory law that passes strict scrutiny, and in fact, this will be the only time that the Supreme Court has found that this higher burden on the state has ever been met. And then we're going to look at a couple of, the two exceptions to the Dormant Commerce Clause. These are listed, I think, on the end of the handout that I put on the Twin page, and I will expect you to know these exceptions. So let's actually start out with the first exception to the Dormant Commerce Clause, which is implicated in the first case that was in the reading today, Maine versus Taylor. So let's discuss this issue of congressional authorization before we get to the substance of that case. This idea is discussed on the first 2 pages of the opinion. So, congressional authorization. The Dormant Commerce Clause, you'll recall, there is no such thing textually in the Constitution as the Dormant Commerce Clause. The doctrine of the Dormant Commerce Clause comes from the Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3 Commerce Clause itself, which is a grant of power to Congress. So one of the reasons that the court invented this doctrine was in part to protect Congress's prerogative to regulate interstate commerce. It's clear that Congress has the power to regulate commerce, and the court has never explicitly said that the states absolutely can't regulate interstate commerce. But this is one way to protect Congress when it appears that the states are doing too much to interfere with interstate commerce. And the idea is the idea behind congressional authorization that Congress should be the last word on interstate commerce regulations. Thus, if Congress wants to allow a state to highly interfere with interstate commerce, then Congress can authorize that state to interfere with interstate commerce. Right? So it's an odd doctrine in that although a state statute can in and of itself be unconstitutional, it appears that Congress can authorize what would otherwise be unconstitutional action. But what seems like a strange rule, the strangeness at least disappears if you understand the rationale behind the doctrine, that it exists to protect Congress's clear power, and if Congress decides that it wants to exercise that power via legislation, and that legislation amounts to authorizing the states to discriminate against interstate commerce, then that is fine. Because the court, in striking a statute down as a violation of the Dormant Commerce Clause, is not saying that this sort of commercial regulation is beyond the Constitution. It's saying that the wrong level of government is engaging in this regulation of commerce. Right? That Congress has the undoubted power to regulate commerce. The state's power is far more dubious, and therefore, when the states regulate commerce to a degree that it looks discriminatory, that's when the court steps in. So Congress can authorize states to do what would otherwise look like a violation of the Dormant Commerce Clause. One way that Congress has done this is through authorizing interstate compacts. We saw reference to this a number of weeks ago when we looked at the New York versus United States case. Remember, that was the commandeering case that we read. And one of the background facts to that legislation is that the court had authorized some states to form interstate compacts that had radioactive waste disposal sites in them. And these states could then charge higher rates to other states that had not yet come up with a solution to the disposal of low-level radioactive waste. And ordinarily, a state couldn't charge a special tax or an import duty on another state. But if Congress authorizes it, then they can. The one thing that we learn from the Maine versus Taylor case is that when Congress does authorize a state to do what would otherwise be a violation of the Dormant Commerce Clause, Congress must be clear about it. Or as the court in Maine versus Taylor says, Congress must give an unambiguous indication of its intent to do so. So why does this come up? Well, you should notice something odd should have jumped out at you by reading that first section of the opinion on page 1 of the Maine versus Taylor case. This is a federal prosecution under a federal law, the Lacey Act. So why would a federal prosecution raise any Dormant Commerce Clause issue? As, after all, the Dormant Commerce Clause only works to prohibit state laws. Well, you can see this is a unique act. It makes it a federal crime to import, export, transport, sell, receive, acquire, or purchase in interstate or foreign commerce any fish or wildlife taken, possessed, transported, or sold in violation of any law or regulation of any state. So what the Lacey Act does is it federalizes state law. It says if this was a violation of state law, it's also a violation of federal law. So Taylor was prosecuted under the federal law, but he was only prosecuted under federal law because this was importing these bait fish was a crime under state law, was prohibited by state law. And you can see the state law at the very bottom of page 1 in the footnote. A person is guilty of importing live bait if he imports into this state any live fish, including smelts, which are commonly used for bait fishing in inland waters. So because of that state statute, he was charged with a federal crime. But what the court says here is that Lacey Act is so broad that it can't be interpreted as authorizing this particular Maine statute. So although there's a federal law here, it's not the sort of federal law that amounts to authorization of a state statute that would otherwise be a violation of the Dormant Commerce Clause. Right? And the court says that in the middle of page 2. This court has exempted state statutes from the limitations implied limitations of the clause only when the congressional direction to do so has been unmistakably clear. And then in the next paragraph, the court says an unambiguous indication of congressional intent is required before a federal statute will be read to authorize otherwise invalid legislation. All right, so that is one exception to the Dormant Commerce Clause, is Congress might authorize a state to do what would otherwise be a violation of the Dormant Commerce Clause. All right, so let's look at the case itself. So the usual questions that you should ask when you see a state statute that's likely to implicate the Dormant Commerce Clause, you want to know what the statute exactly does, what the justification or the rationale is behind the statute. You want to determine whether the statute is discriminatory or non-discriminatory, and based on that conclusion, you'll be able to explain what the appropriate level of scrutiny is, and then you can actually do the hard part, which is applying that test. Although whether a statute is discriminatory or not might also be a difficult inquiry given the facts. So Maine versus Taylor, what is the statute? Well, we just looked at it. It's there in footnote 1. It prohibits the importation of live bait if a person is guilty of importing live bait if he imports into this state any live fish. So importing in and of itself is the crime. So that necessarily involves bringing fish from out of state in state. So any bait fish then that is not a Maine-grown bait fish is going to be against the law. So what's the justification for this? Well, the state says that it wants to protect state fisheries from parasites and from invasive species. So if we go over to Part 3A on page 3, we see two justifications there in that first paragraph. Right? For this threat of parasites that might infect the native Maine fish, and then the problem of non-invasive species. So the bait fish shipment from out of state might include other species within it, and if invasive species gets into Maine waters, that could wreak havoc on the local ecosystem. So justifications for this ban on importing bait fish. Is the ban discriminatory or non-discriminatory? So here, that question is pretty easy. As the court says in the middle of page 2, this is a statute that discriminates on its face. Right. So we don't even have to go through the test that we saw in the Hunt Apple case, because we don't have to imply discrimination. The discrimination is explicit on the face of the statute. It says if you have bait fish from out of state, don't bother selling them in Maine because that's not allowed. All right, so it's discriminatory on its face. Therefore, we know that discriminatory statutes face a high hurdle. They have to pass strict scrutiny. So how does the court start the scrutiny analysis? Well, we know what our strict scrutiny test is. There must be a legitimate local purpose, and that purpose can't be achieved in any less interstate commerce discriminatory way. So is the purpose here a legitimate local purpose? And is the statute the only way that we can achieve this purpose? So the court acknowledges that the native bait fish might be harmed by parasites. If they're parasites that are on the same species, there's every reason to think that the parasites would be transferred from one foreign fish to a native fish. And then the second concern about invasive species, it's highly likely that an invasive species would damage a unique and fragile ecosystem. We don't know what invasive species might be present in a shipment, and depending on what species come in, it's unknown what damage such a species could cause to the local ecosystem. Now, Justice Stevens in his dissent criticizes the majority's acceptance of these local purposes because, according to Justice Stevens, a lot of this seems hypothetical. He says on page 6, if Maine wishes to rely on its interest in ecological preservation, it must show that interest and the infeasibility of other alternatives with far greater specificity. Right? So the way that Maine talks and the way that the court discusses it, it's all of this is hypothetical. If this happened, this might happen. And Justice Stevens would demand more when we're in the realm of strict scrutiny. What about equally effective non-discriminatory alternatives? Isn't there some other way that Maine could protect this interest in its ecosystem without a flat-out ban against importing this product from other states? And the court says no, because there aren't any scientifically feasible methods to test shipments for parasites. Right? The court says that, so this is on page 3, the second paragraph, this is essentially a physical impossibility. So no scientific alternatives. So therefore, the court concludes that this is one of those rare cases that passes strict scrutiny, or at least it's one of those rare cases where these two tests are met. There is one last inquiry that the court makes over on page, let's look at page 4. In Part B of the opinion, the court does note that if a alternative procedure was to arise, then Maine would might not be able to justify this ban anymore. In other words, if scientific advancements developed to the point where there was a method for testing shipments of bait fish for this parasite, then this ban might not be justifiable anymore. But until that point, the court thinks that these two prongs of strict scrutiny have been met. Part C of the opinion, the court explains that there's no evidence of improper legislative motivation here, and Justice Stevens is strongly hinting that that is the case in his dissenting opinion. But the court says there's no evidence that Maine passed this statute primarily to protect its own local bait fish industry. As Justice Stevens says in his dissent, there's a flourishing domestic bait fish industry in Maine, and they sure look like the beneficiaries of this statute. Well, clearly they are the beneficiaries because only Maine bait fish breeders are going to be able to sell bait fish in the state of Maine. So they clearly are benefiting from it. But the court thinks that that benefit is incidental here because the real purpose is not to benefit a local industry at the expense of out-of-state industries, the purpose is to preserve the ecological environment. And Justice Stevens doesn't buy that justification. Okay. All right, so that is the one case that the court has found passes strict scrutiny. Let's look at the second exception to the Dormant Commerce Clause, and it's this so-called market participant exception. So this one takes a bit more explanation than the congressional authorization exception. So what's important here for the market participant exception is the form that the state action takes, not the effect of that state action. So we've been considering the effects of statutes, right? We've been considering how burdensome is the statute on interstate commerce. Does the statute have a discriminatory effect? Does the statute burden interstate commerce more than it benefits the state? But here, the question will be not about how the statute actually affects the economy, how the statute actually affects commerce. The question is going to be, in what form is the state acting? Is the state acting in its sovereign capacity, or is the state acting as a market participant? What is meant by a market participant? If the state is merely acting as a purchaser or a proprietor of goods in the stream of interstate commerce, then the clause does not apply. So one way to think about the state as market participant is ask yourself, is the state doing something that any other market participant could do, that you or I could do, that any private business could do? Is the state merely buying a good in the marketplace? Is the state merely selling goods that it makes itself in the marketplace? If so, then the state is acting as a market participant and the Dormant Commerce Clause does not apply. The Dormant Commerce Clause only applies, the court tells us, when the state is acting as a sovereign, exercising its taxing and regulatory powers. Right? So when the state's exercising its sovereign powers, it's doing things that only a sovereign can do, that you and I can't do, that a private business can't do. Right? You or I can't tax someone. Right? You, a private business, cannot write a law that people have to follow, and if they don't follow it, they go to jail. Right? Only a sovereign can do that sort of thing. So if the state is acting in its regulatory sovereign capacity, that's when the clause applies. Right? Maine saying it's illegal and you'll go to jail if you import bait fish, that's something only a sovereign can do. Now, if Maine was selling bait fish that it grew itself, that would be Maine acting as a market participant. All right, so let's look at the case we have in the handout, Reeves versus Stake. Is the state acting, the state of South Dakota in this case, is it acting as a market participant or is it acting as a market regulator in the state's sovereign capacity? So in this case, we have the state of South Dakota. We're told that in 1919, South Dakota makes plans to build a cement plant that will be operated by a state entity, the South Dakota Cement Commission. Right? Apparently, at the early 20th century, there was a cement shortage 100 years ago, and South Dakota wants to make sure that in the future they're always set up to have cement whenever their citizens need cement or whenever the state needs cement. So there's this state-run cement plant. And the facts further tell us that eventually they start to produce more cement than is actually needed within the state, and therefore the state plant decides to sell the cement to anyone, to any private buyers. And one of the cement plant's best customers is Reeves. We're told that Reeves was a customer from 1958 to 1978. They were a company that operated out of Wyoming, and So they made ready mix and they sold it in primarily in Wyoming. And 95% of Reeves's cement comes from the South Dakota plant. So Reeves is heavily dependent on the South Dakota state-run cement plant. But in the 70s, there's a shortage of cement, there's increased demand for cement, and South Dakota can no longer meet the needs of all of its customers. So it decides that it is going to prefer in-state customers to out-of-state customers. So on the face of it, it might look like South Dakota is discriminating against out-of-staters in favor of in-staters. But the court tells us that the state is not using its sovereign power to discriminate. It's not using its sovereign power to control the market. Instead, South Dakota is acting like a private business in deciding with whom it will deal. So just as anyone who makes a good can decide with whom to trade, the same can be said of South Dakota. The actual market impact, we're told, is immaterial simply because the Dormant Commerce Clause does not apply. Okay. You see this argument about the impact over on page 10 of the opinion. There's this argument that South Dakota has exploited the interstate market in cement. The court rejects that view because South Dakota doesn't have to make cement at all. South Dakota could, from the start of their cement plant, have only ever sold to South Dakotans. And therefore, this argument about exploitation, the court rejects out of hand. The court also invokes federalism concerns here at the bottom of page 10. The court says that to hold South Dakota to the Dormant Commerce Clause in a case like this would threaten the future fashioning or effective and creative programs for solving local problems and distributing government largesse. A healthy regard for federalism and good government renders us reluctant to risk these results. So we want states to be innovative. We want states to do exactly what South Dakota did and plan for the future when there might be a cement shortage. And South Dakota's vision and insight shouldn't be held against it at the time when South Dakota most needs cement. So the court says there are federalism concerns here as well. You can see that there's a dissenting opinion. This was a 5-4 opinion. And the dissenting opinion written by Justice Powell starts out by saying this policy represents precisely the kind of economic protectionism that the Commerce Clause was intended to prevent. Why does Justice Powell think that this is such a problem? Why doesn't he like this distinction between market regulator and market participant? So the dissent here is really more interested in the effect rather than the form that the state action takes. And the recognition that Justice Powell makes is, sure, South Dakota might just be a seller of cement, but when you're the state, you can have a really large impact on the economy that a private entity wouldn't. And therefore, the state shouldn't be able to wield its weight in that fashion under the excuse of we're not regulating, we're merely participating in the market. On the other hand, I guess the response, though, would be that there are private entities that wouldn't be subject to the Constitution or the Dormant Commerce Clause that would be even more powerful in the market than South Dakota. Take a business, a private business like Microsoft. My guess is that Microsoft is a far more powerful market participant than South Dakota could ever be. And if Bill Gates wanted to buy up all the cement in the world, he probably could. So just because you have a lot of power doesn't seem to be, or market power doesn't seem to be a function of whether or not you're a state government or not. I guess, would be the response to Justice Powell's concern. On the other hand, Justice Powell does say at the top of page 12, state action burdening interstate trade is no less state action because it's accomplished by a public agency authorized to participate in the private market. And certainly Justice Powell is absolutely correct on that point. That state action is state action, and it shouldn't stop being state action just because of the form that that state action takes. If South Dakota did something like, say, we'll sell cement to everyone except Chinese people, or we'll sell cement to everyone except women, South Dakota would not be able to get away with an accusation that it was violating the Equal Protection Clause just because it was selling cement rather than regulating something. So that would certainly be state action for purposes of the 14th Amendment. All right, so that's the market participant exception. Let me point out to you an important exception to the exception, or not exception to the exception, but let's make sure that we understand when it wouldn't apply. And let me point out to you a case that's in the book on page 372, South Central Timber Development, Inc. versus Wanaque. So here Alaska was selling timber, state-owned timber. So far, it looks like the Reeves case. We have a state selling a product that it owns. But one of the requirements of the Alaska law was that purchasers of state-owned timber had to process the timber in-state before exporting it. So anyone could go into Alaska and buy timber, and according to Reeves, Alaska doesn't even have to let just anyone buy timber. But they had a condition. They said, before you take the timber out of state, once you buy it, you have to process it in state. So, you have to get someone in state to cut it or whatever other processing timber needs. The court says the limit of the market participant doctrine must be that it allows a state to impose burdens on commerce within the market in which it is a participant, but allows it to go no further. So the only market that Alaska was participating in was the timber market. Alaska was not also a participant in the timber processing market. So who was going to process the timber? Well, presumably private entities who lived in Alaska, private timber processors, right? And this is problematic from a Dormant Commerce Clause perspective because what Alaska is doing is it's saying you must patronize a local Alaska business. You cannot use any out-of-state timber processor. And that's very different from what went on in the Reeves case because now Alaska is funneling business to its private sector. And that is precisely what the Dormant Commerce Clause is designed to prevent. Using your regulatory powers to favor in-state private businesses at the expense of out-of-state businesses. All right. I went over the justifications for the Dormant Commerce Clause on the first day of class this week on Monday. And let me review them, adding a couple things along the way. So remember, the basic theory is a free trade theory that we don't want any impediments to the flow of interstate commerce. The intention of the federal union, one of the framers' main intentions, was that we have a free market within the nation. Right? They had seen the problems of states competing with each other, states being jealous of each other, and they wanted to prevent that. And so closely tied to that idea is this protection of national unity, that you don't want states starting trade wars with each other. Just to show you an example of how that might arise, I'll just call your attention to the case on page 370 in the notes, this fight between Mississippi and Louisiana over milk. You can see what happens when states start fighting with each other by passing legislation that's responsive to things the other states do. Remember, the political process was also an argument here that when you have a law that benefits your in-state businesses and harms primarily or only out-of-state businesses, then the political pressures that you would ordinarily expect to correct laws that are harmful to business would not be present, because the only people harmed are the people that don't vote in the state, and therefore it's a failure of the political process, according to the court. So that brings us to this next case that I do want to discuss on page 373 in some detail. This is the case Westland Creamery versus Healy. So in this case, Massachusetts had imposed essentially a tax. The book here calls it a fee on all milk sold by dealers in Massachusetts. So this is a milk tax, but it's non-discriminatory, right? So this applies to milk regardless of where the milk is coming from. Massachusetts produced milk is taxed at the same rate that milk coming in from Maine or from Rhode Island or from Wisconsin would be taxed. So that seems fine. Then we also have the issue of a subsidy. And states can give their local businesses subsidies. That is also not considered to be a problem from the perspective of the Dormant Commerce Clause, because every state can subsidize its own industries. So we have two things going on here that ordinarily wouldn't be problematic. But the court finds a problem when they're joined together. So either standing on its own wouldn't be a problem. But what do we learn from this regime that's taking place in Massachusetts? So what would happen is all of the money that comes in from this milk fee or this milk tax gets put into the account from which the subsidy to the Massachusetts dairy farmers comes from. And the court says that that combination creates constitutional problems. The court says in the quoted part on page 373, by conjoining a tax and a subsidy, Massachusetts has created a program more dangerous to interstate commerce than either part alone. The court explains that non-discriminatory measures, like the tax here, are usually upheld in spite of any adverse effects on interstate commerce, in part because the existence of major in-state interests adversely affected is a powerful safeguard against legislative abuse, right? So the reason that a generally applicable tax ordinarily wouldn't be problematic is because if Massachusetts dairy farmers also have to pay the tax, and the tax was thought to be too burdensome, those Massachusetts dairy farmers would complain to the Massachusetts legislature, and the legislature would respond appropriately by imposing a tax that is not too high or too steep. But the court says, however, when a non-discriminatory tax is coupled with a subsidy to one of the groups hurt by the tax, a state's political process can no longer be relied upon to prevent legislative abuse. So what was going on here is, yes, there was a tax on all milk, including Massachusetts milk, but then Massachusetts would turn around and give money back to the Massachusetts dairy farmers. And so the court says, when you add those two things together, it's almost as though the Massachusetts dairy farmers aren't harmed at all by the tax. Only the out-of-state producers are harmed by the tax. And that looks, practically speaking, like a tax only on out-of-state milk. So these sort of innovations, the court tells us, can violate the Dormant Commerce Clause. And then also continuing on in the book, on page 374, we see a lengthy note on the critiques of the Dormant Commerce Clause, and that goes through the end on page 379. The primary critiques that are discussed in that note are the critiques of Justices Scalia and Thomas. They critique the balancing test along the lines of balancing tests are really just drawing the court into policy decisions, because how can anyone really balance whether or not discrimination against commerce is outweighed by protection to an ecosystem, right? Or the health of milk is outweighed by discrimination against out-of-state dairy farmers, right? Those sorts of weighings of benefits and burdens, the Thomas and Scalia say, are fundamentally legislative judgments that the court should stay out of. But I would just have you note that is Justice Scalia's critique of every balancing test, not just balancing tests within the Dormant Commerce Clause realm. And then their other critique is a textual argument that the Dormant Commerce Clause is not in the text. It's implied from a positive grant of power to Congress, and they have a number of objections just based on the non-textual nature of the doctrine. Thomas is still on the court. Of course, Justice Scalia has passed. The most recent decision was just last year. It's this Tennessee wine and spirits case. This is in the supplement on page 54. Brand new case. The court, by a 7-2 decision, invalidated the law that was at issue there. And I don't remember if it was the Tennessee law itself. But anyway, the vote was 7-2. Justice Thomas dissented, as you would expect him to, from the criticism that you see here, and he was joined by Justice Gorsuch. So it looks like the split is the same as it had been, with members of the court still favoring the Dormant Commerce Clause. And this really, the Dormant Commerce Clause is somewhat interesting ideologically or from a partisan perspective in a certain sense, because the members of the court, especially on the conservative wing, have been very split on this Dormant Commerce Clause idea, with people like Scalia and Thomas criticizing it based on the lack of constitutional textual support. But then you have other conservatives like Chief Justice Roberts and Justice Alito, and before them Justice Kennedy, being strong proponents of the Dormant Commerce Clause because of their belief in the free market. Some have said that the Dormant Commerce Clause is premised on the idea that the Constitution fundamentally protects a capitalist system. And when states pass laws that violate the Dormant Commerce Clause, that's another way of saying that states are passing protectionist legislation that is at odds with a free market theory of the national economy. All right, let's look at a problem. Concerned about the health risks associated with smoking and the attendant costs to the state providing health care to smokers, state has taken the extraordinary step of prohibiting the sale of all tobacco products in the state. State has a tiny cigar industry, but otherwise produces no tobacco products. Out-of-state tobacco companies sue, claiming the law violates the Commerce Clause. They note that as a result of the law, they potentially stand to lose millions of dollars in revenue each year from tobacco sales. The state argues that it spends $1.2 million per year on tobacco-caused health care. Other costs include losses in productivity and absenteeism caused by smoking-related illnesses, which the state estimates at $1.5 million per year. What should a reviewing court do? You might want to pause and read that question again so that you have a clear sense of what the facts are and what's being asked. So what should a reviewing court do? A, invalidate the law because the burden on interstate commerce exceeds the putative local benefits. B, sustain the law because it is facially neutral. C, invalidate the law because it discriminates against interstate commerce. Or D, sustain the law because the burden on interstate commerce does not clearly exceed the benefits to the state. So, as I mentioned before, you should have some sort of method to your analysis of state laws that look like they're going to pose Dormant Commerce Clause problems. Identify the statute. What does the statute do here? Well, the statute prohibits the sale of all tobacco products in the state, a flat-out prohibition on the sale of tobacco products. What's the justification? The justification appears to be a health-based justification, but coupled with an economic argument that this is very costly to the state in terms of healthcare costs, but also costs to their state economy in terms of lost productivity. So, first question, is the statute discriminatory or not? Well, it says that the state has taken the extraordinary step of prohibiting the sale of all tobacco products in the state. So the language appears to be facially neutral. Whether the tobacco product comes from out of state or from in state is immaterial as to whether the law is violated. So the statute appears not to be discriminatory on its face. So I think we could eliminate, just from that, we could eliminate C. Invalidate the law because it discriminates on its face, or because it discriminates against interstate commerce, but it doesn't, in fact, discriminate against interstate commerce. So if it's not discriminatory, well, it's not facially discriminatory. I suppose we should ask, does it have any discriminatory effect or purpose? Now, there is the problem that I guess the best argument for that is that there really aren't any tobacco companies within the state, although we are given the fact that there is a tiny cigar industry in the state. So presumably that industry would be negatively impacted because the tiny cigar industry would not be able to sell within the state. Presumably they could still sell, if they survive, they could still sell outside the state. But it's prohibiting only the sale of products, not the production or the manufacture of such products. So it doesn't appear that it is favoring any in-state business. So when we talk about a law that's discriminatory in effect, it would have to be discriminating against something in favor of something else, and there really doesn't appear to be any industry that has benefited from this statute. So again, there's really no evidence that this is discriminatory. So if it's not discriminatory, then it must be neutral. B says sustain the law because it's facially neutral. But we know that that is a bad answer for a couple of reasons. One, as we saw, that there are ways that a statute can be discriminatory even if it's facially neutral. It might be discriminatory in purpose or effect, like the law in Hunt versus Washington was. But even if a law is neutral, it doesn't automatically get upheld. There's still another test, this balancing test that the law would have to go through. All right, so the two that are remaining, A and D, A says invalidate the law, and D says sustain the law. Now let's look closely at the rationales that each is offering. So first of all, if we don't have a discriminatory law, and we know that we're going to have to apply the balancing test, we should remind ourselves on whom is the burden, on which party does the burden fall if we have to apply the balancing test. Right? And the answer is the challenger. Right? The state only has the burden if it's a discriminatory law and we're in strict scrutiny, but if it's a non-discriminatory law that has to undergo the Pike balancing test, then the burden is on the challenging party. So if the burden's on the challenging party, that means that the statute is highly likely to be upheld. Right, so let's look at the reasons given. Invalidate because the burdens on interstate commerce exceeds the putative local benefits, or sustain because the burden on interstate commerce does not clearly exceed the benefits to the state. So what can we tell about the benefits and burdens? Well, these companies say they stand to lose, quote unquote, millions of dollars, but there's nothing more specific than that in the problem. And then we see that the state says that it spends $1.2 million a year on tobacco-caused health care and $1.5 million lost per year on lost productivity. So add those things together, that's $2.7 million. We don't have any strong evidence that the loss to these other companies is more than that. And the state usually doesn't have to, when we're in this balancing test, that's not the strict scrutiny test, the state isn't held to account and prove all of its interests with any degree of scientific accuracy. And the burden is on the challengers, so you would think the challengers would do a lot more than just show that they're losing millions of dollars here. So because the benefit of the doubt goes to the validity of the law, the best answer here will be D, sustain the law because the burden on commerce does not clearly exceed the benefits. There's also another problem with the A answer, and it has to do with that adverb there, clearly exceed. A simply says the burden on interstate commerce exceeds the putative local benefits, but that's technically an incorrect statement of the law. It makes it sound as though you can invalidate a law if the burden on interstate commerce is 51% and the local benefits are 49%. But that's not accurate. And those percentages can mean whatever you want them to mean. But if it's that close on the scale, the law does not get invalidated. The language of the balancing test, go back and look at the language of the balancing test on the slides, is that for the statute to be invalidated, the burden on interstate commerce has to clearly exceed the benefits to the state. And the facts that we have here just don't show that degree of disparity between the benefits and the burdens here. So again, the answer is D. One other thing that I would recommend looking at is, if you look on the syllabus, there's, besides the new Tennessee case that's listed in the supplement, there's also a problem in the supplement that would be a good problem to practice writing out as an essay. And I will try to post some of the I think there's a case or two that mirror the facts of that problem, and I will try to post them in the appropriate folder on the Twin page probably tomorrow.